Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second panel, our final panel for this symposium. And this panel is entitled Scaling Up Decarbonization in the Value Chain. And we're really using this panel, if you like, to drill down into the concept or into the issue of Scope 3 emissions. As we've heard, of course, achieving decarbonization in the value chain is a multifaceted challenge. And it's particularly so if you consider Scope 3 emissions. There's significant impact, but also that these are the most challenging to track and to reduce. I mean, as Shanta mentioned, there are 11 times more emissions in the value chain than in normal operational activities. So it's crucial then for businesses, policymakers and stakeholders to collaborate and conduct through assessments, leverage on technologies and implement these targeted strategies to measure and mitigate Scope 3 emissions effectively. Technologies and collaboration are key here. So we've convened industry experts to discuss this critical role of addressing Scope 3 emissions. So I'm very pleased to introduce, again, and give you a bit more detail on our speakers. We have Mr. Shane Guha-Takuta, who's the General Manager of Investor Relations and Sustainability at IJM Corporation Berhad. And he's responsible for communicating the group's financial performance and corporate developments with fund managers and financial analysts since 2007. And since 2015, he's been steering the group's corporate sustainability strategy and its integration across IJM's businesses. We have Mr. Shahril Azwar Jimin, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Maybank. Shahril was appointed Maybank's first Chief Sustainability Officer in 2021. He's responsible for leading the bank's sustainability efforts in ESG areas. He's held various leadership positions within Maybank Group, including the first CEO of Maybank Foundation, Chief Commercial Officer of Maybank Ageas Holdings, Berhad, Chief Sales Officer of Etika Insurance and Takaful, and most recently, he's been a council member of the 30% Club Malaysia, and he chairs the Association of Banks in Malaysia's ESG Committee. Next, we have Mr. Rashid Redzwa Anwaruddin, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Sime Darby Plantation Berhad. Rashid was appointed Head Group Sustainability of Sime Darby Plantation Berhad in 2020, and he's responsible for implementing on-the-ground programs to promote responsible and ethical production throughout SDP's operations and global supply chain. He was redesignated as Chief Sustainability Officer of SDP on the 1st of April 2022. Finally, Mr. Sayuti Wan Hussein of Petronas. He's a General Manager, Strategy, Policy and Regulation of Corporate Sustainability, Petronas. He has a 20-year working experience in Petronas. He started his career in 2002, and he has since then I can't go through this whole very impressive list, Mr. Sayuti. I will pick out the highlights of you joining the corporate strategic planning in 2015, and subsequently, most recently in 2020, he was seconded to the World Economic Forum in Geneva as a project fellow in shaping the future of energy and materials. So thank you so much for joining us. I think we will start with some poll questions first for the audience. Okay, so if as usual, right, you've got your QR code, and your first question is, what approaches is your company adopting to decarbonize? Okay, it looks like a mixed bag so far. I think mainly energy efficient improvements, employee engagement and behavior change, also adopting renewable energy. Those look to be our main 3 answers. Okay. Yep, those look like the top 3. Yep, okay. Adopting renewable energy, energy efficiency improvements, employee engagement and behavior change. Our next question: what is the current status of your organization's Scope 3 emissions journey? Okay. Okay. Okay, it seems to be the majority is still, we have not conducted any assessment of our Scope 3 emissions yet. But then there's following closely, we have started measuring our Scope 3 emissions, but do not yet have a clear baseline. Okay, I think this is going to be an interesting panel then for the audience to hear more about Scope 3 emissions. Final question? Ah, that's it. Okay, so can we turn to our experts to tell us a bit more? Can I ask for each of the panel, if you could just begin by sharing more about your organization's near-term and long-term climate targets, so 2030 and 2050, and a bit on your current Scope 3 decarbonization initiatives. Okay, so I think if I could start with Mr. Wan Sayuti.
Hello, Assalamualaikum, and a very good afternoon. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and my fellow panelists. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I know it's we quite late in the evening. For Petronas, I think we started our journey in sustainability way back in 2001. I think back then we first formed this sustainable development department, but it sits with our group HSC. I think the effort is very much on the compliance driven kind of lens. And in 2021, when we elevate the whole function to be a corporate sustainability division, and the creation of the Chief Sustainability Officer as a direct report to the President and Group CEO, I think that marks a significant a difference in the way we conduct sustainability at the enterprise level, and sustainability become the strategic guidance or driver for the overall organization strategy. And with that also we have our statement of purpose. Previously we had our vision and our statement of purpose. Big part of the purpose is about enriching life for a sustainable future. So sustainability become part of that. And in 2020, November, we announced our aspiration to get to net zero carbon emission by 2050. And when Petronas announced it in November 2020, we were the first amongst the oil and gas player in Asia. And 2 years down the road, last year, a lot of efforts in 2022 is about putting down the details of the plan with clear targets and also timeline. So we launched in November 2022, just before COP 27 last year, the net zero carbon emission pathway. So in this pathway, I think it's available online. You can just find in Petronas website. We put short-term targets, 2024, for capping emissions in Malaysia at 49.5. So we say that though our productions number is still growing, we want to decouple emissions from productions. So for that to happen, decoupling production from emission, technological solution must come into picture, right? And 2025, we set a target to reduce 50% of our methane emission management. Methane is critical because Petronas is one of the largest natural gas producer and exporter, and Malaysia also one of the largest exporter of natural gas LNG of the world. And methane is one of the most potent GHG, given its ability to trap heat 80 times more than CO2 in the span of 20 years' time. So we put specific methane targets, 50% reduction by 2025. In the midterm, 2030, we put an absolute target to reduce our GHG or carbon emission by 25% based on 2019 baseline or base year. So 25% from 2019, that's on the overall carbon. And we also put methane targets, 50% reduction for Malaysia and 70% reduction for our global operations. And at the same time, these targets are for Scope 1 and Scope 2. For Scope 3, we actually taking a step approach. I think what we need to recognize is the magnitude and the size of Scope 3. So what we did last year was we worked with external or third party to validate and verify our numbers for Scope 1, Scope 2, and also getting into the rigor of assessing and baselining Scope 3. So that's what we have now. At the same time, Petronas also last year announced our TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. We will start reporting in this year. You will find in our integrated report, TCFD, and also CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. We're also reporting in accordance to CDP. And last year, we did for World Economic Forum Stakeholder Capitalism Matrix. So all this, again, is aligning with the international framework and standards, making sure our numbers are robust and credible and third-party reviewed and validated. Because I know, I heard in the previous session, maybe Scope 1, Scope 2 is more straightforward, but if a company like Petronas with global operation of more than 100 countries, with different entities, some are, 100% owned, some are just equity shares. So how do we make sure that we follow the GHG protocol reporting guideline to make sure we get our credible numbers? Thank you.
Thank you. Can we go then from Petronas to Sime Darby Plantation with the same question, near term, long term, but also focusing then on the Scope 3 decarbonization.
Yeah. Thanks, Adeline, and thanks for inviting us to share some of the work that we're currently doing around climate change. So with regards to climate change itself, we started looking at our emissions profile way back in 2010, if not mistaken. And back then, we were focusing mainly on our Scope 1 and Scope 2. And eventually we started looking at Scope 3 as well. So we actually took a separate, a sort of different approach with regards to our SBTi sort of submission. So last year itself, we made a commitment to net zero in line with SBTi. And what we did was, we took a bit of time trying to really understand, number one, what exactly does it entail to actually become a net zero by 2050, net zero company by 2050, and what are the sort of short, medium, and long-term targets and initiatives that we need to put in place to meet those specific targets, right? So we took an approach where we tried to at least understand what are the key things that we needed to do to meet these targets, and then we made a commitment. And once we made the commitment, we then immediately made our submission to SBTi at the same time as well, because at that point in time, we were quite clear on what we needed to do, at least on the short to medium term. But, 2030 onwards, up to 2050, there's still some gray areas. I mean, anything can happen post 2030, right? So with regards to our approach to decarbonization and meeting our net zero commitment by 2050, what we've done is we've identified 3 key strategies that we are currently working on. So number one, and it basically boils down to targeting the most material emission sources in our operations and also within our supply chain as well. So I'll quickly go through our operations and I'll talk a bit more about supply chain. So with regards to our operations itself, number one, when we looked at our emissions footprint for our current operations, there are two key areas which basically has the most emissions from. So number one is methane emissions from all of our mills. So globally we have 72 or 73 mills globally, and each and every mill has a wastewater treatment plant which emits methane. And basically, one of the key strategies that we even started way back in 2010 is to capture that methane and basically convert that either into electricity or any other usage. So to date we have 14 of these biogas plants up and running, and the target is by 2030 to at least have 40 of our mills with methane capture. So one of the key things that we are doing now is we are accelerating our renewables business, where each and every one of the biogas plants needs to be economically feasible. And that's why for the past 10 years we've been trying to really learn and understand how we do implement these sort of things in such a way that now we are quite comfortable with the technology and how to run and operate a biogas plant, that we are comfortable enough in accelerating that. The second part of our renewables efforts as well is basically looking at solar as well. So if to look at our operations itself, we have a total of 600,000 hectares of land bank. We are the largest producer of certified sustainable palm oil by land bank size, and there's a lot of land. In Malaysia itself, we are the largest private landowner in Malaysia. So essentially what we are doing now is we are looking at each and every one of our plantations to see whether or not, if we were to convert that plantation or parcels of that plantation into a solar farm, whether or not it will make more economical sense for us as well. So to date, we have one large-scale solar farm up and running already in the northern region, and we're looking at, again, accelerating that particular progress. So that's one of the strategies. The second one is essentially looking at land use. The second largest, another large source of emissions is basically around land use change and the emissions that we get from land use itself. And that's where we have a large program in place where we are looking at transforming the way that we approach land use in our operations, the 600,000 hectares that we have. So essentially we're looking at how do we reduce emissions from our replanting? How do we reduce, how can we reduce emissions from our peat plantations? And also we're looking at increasing the amount of areas where we can reforest. So unplantable reserves, areas which are no longer productive, conservation set-asides. We are looking at reforesting those areas. And in total now we have more than 42,000 hectares of areas considered as conservation set-asides. And we are now looking at further expanding those areas to essentially sequester more carbon from the atmosphere itself. And that's basically two key strategies. And the third one, essentially, the one that we're going to be talking about today is around supply chain. So if to look at our Scope 3 emissions itself and our supply chain, when we actually, as part of the work that we did to submit to SBTi, we actually did a baseline of our Scope 3 emissions. And what we found was a majority of our Scope 3 emissions essentially comes from feedstock. So the third-party oil that we purchase from third-party mills and traders, and third-party fruits that we purchase from third-party estates and smallholders as well. So the idea that we have now is whatever interventions that we do in our own operations can also be replicated to our supply chain as well. So if we were to implement a biogas plant at one of our mills, that also can be replicated to one of the 400 plus mills in Malaysia, for example. The sort of land use transformation efforts that we do, our no deforestation commitment that we have, that we are currently monitoring our supply chain, can also be replicated to our operations. And essentially, that's where the focus that we have with regards to supply chain itself, which is basically reducing the amount of emissions from our feedstock, which is essentially number one, reducing methane emissions from third-party mills, and also reducing the emissions from land use change, so our no deforestation commitment, and also increasing conservation set-asides and reforestation programs in our supply chain. So I'll stop there for now, and we can discuss in a bit more detail in a bit.
Definitely. Can we move to IJM and Shane? Thank you.
Thanks, Adeline. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel as well. Maybe before I begin on where we are, where IJM is at the moment in terms of our climate commitments, I'll just give a brief explanation on IJM's business, and it's pretty much setting up the the basis or the context of me being on this panel today as well. So we are a construction conglomerate. We are in the downstream part of the business. We've got a property development arm as well as concession assets, particularly in highways and a port. And then in the midstream, we are into civil construction works, typically high-rise buildings, as well as infrastructure. And in the upstream, we've got a building materials arm. So we're pretty represented across the construction supply chain, if you like. For us, we took the our climate commitments pretty seriously. So we spent the last 1.5 years actually coming up with a very thorough profiling of our carbon emissions. And this covered Scope 1, Scope 2, and 6 categories of Scope 3 as well at that time. What we then, just recently announced, just 2 months ago, was, only after making this thorough assessment and the commitment, our climate commitment is rather unorthodox. It's not unique, but it's rather unorthodox. And it really stems from two main drivers or two main factors. Firstly, in our assessment for the last 1.5 years, what we found was that the world will move by 1.5 degrees in the 2030s. So it's quite near. It's upon us. Secondly, second main factor is that 90% of our carbon emissions come from Scope 3. And 90% of that, Scope 3, comes from just Category 1, which is purchased goods and services. And more than 90% of Category 1 comes from just 3 main products, which are cement, steel, and concrete. So what this means is that because of the first factor, our climate strategy has to, or we're compelled to then come up with a strategy to address both, reducing our carbon footprints, the mitigation aspect, as well as building more resilience, which is the adaptation aspect. And we've applied this same methodology or this same principle, or what we want to do is apply the same principle to our supply chain engagements as well later on. I think based on the second point of having such a high level of Scope 3 emissions, we deviated slightly. So we've used the SBTi as a reference, but we have not yet dared to commit to SBTi, mainly because of the scale of our Scope 3 emissions. If you think about it, having this level of Scope 3 emissions, for us to make a commitment to reduce to zero is a little bit too early, we felt. So we've made a commitment to net zero for our Scope 1, Scope 2, and our operational carbon emissions for Scope 3. But the embodied carbon emissions for Scope 3, that's more of a commitment to engage our supply chain with the view of course, getting the reduction. But at this stage, the commitment for us is to engage with our Scope 3 or with our supply chain. So we've then now come to this point where a lot of our efforts are going to be focusing on Scope 3. That's by and far the biggest of our challenge. Before we made this assessment, we've already we started as well on putting up solar panels, trying to optimize our energy efficiencies, thinking that we were doing enough. But it was only after we made the assessment that we realized the scale and the enormity of our Scope 3. So it's actually quite similar in terms of the statistics that Shanta provided earlier, where 11.4 times, that's so 90% is pretty much 11.4 times thereabouts. So it's quite consistent. Yeah.
Thanks, Shane. Thanks for highlighting that challenge really, in your industry, but I think it's clear across the board. SBTi is not necessarily something you can reach for straight away and be a more staggered journey. Thank you. Can we move to Maybank from construction to financial industry? with
Thank you, Adeline. Thank you, UNGC and Monash, for having me here. Maybank, we came out with our first sustainability report in 2010, one of the earliest PLCs to do so. And we started submitting to CDP about 8 years ago. Feels like such a long time, but a lot of things happened in the last 3 years actually. Not just for Maybank, I believe for most of us here. And the world has changed so much in the last 3 years following the issuance of the UN SDGs, COP, France and all that. So our commitments, our targets, particularly our climate targets, are reflected within the sustainability commitments that we have made. We have 4 sustainability commitments that we initially made in 2021, and we revised it earlier this year given that we had achieved so much in some of those commitments. So the first sustainability commitment that we made is to mobilize 80 billion ringgit in sustainable finance by 2025. We've already done about 39 billion of that. So that's moving very well. The second sustainability commitment that we made was to improve the lives of 2 million households across ASEAN by 2025. Initially, it was 1 million. We revised that to 2 million because we were also doing well. And these numbers are validated by UN Global Compact as well. And we felt that was important against any sustainable financing or climate commitment that we made, because we needed to make sure that Maybank, as a partner for national development in many countries throughout Southeast Asia, we also ensure a just transition. And then our commitment number 3, and this is specifically to our climate commitments, is to firstly achieve carbon neutrality of our own emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2 by 2030, and to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. That's the big one. That's our finance emissions, which I will talk in a little bit. And our 4th commitment is more internal, for our own staff, whom we call Maybankers, to collectively contribute 1 million hours a year on sustainability in various forms, either to help clients or to come up with various projects internally. Again, the methodology for this and also the numbers are given in SPO by UN Global Compact. So those are the 4 commitments, and we actually live by that in Maybank. So with regards to the climate commitments that we've made, first thing that we had to do, since we made these targets, right? Neutrality of our own Scope 1 and Scope 2 by 2030, and then our own finance emissions net zero by 2050, we had to be sure we know where we start from. And that involves getting our baseline. Similar to Shane, as a bank, our Scope 3 emissions is very small. Our Scope 3, our Scope 1 and Scope 2 is very small, right? It only comprises about 0.5% of our total emissions. Our Scope 3 emissions we know is big. So what we had to do is to calculate the finance emissions, and that was a very, very complex process. It took 7 months. We started that project in 2021. And we based our methodology on PCAF, Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, based on 6 asset classes. At that time, it was 6 asset classes. Now they've just increased to 2, which is insurance underwriting and also sovereign bonds. So we completed that last year, and we announced Maybank as the first bank in Malaysia and potentially in the region actually to calculate and to announce its finance emissions. And this year we actually released that after a lot of debate. We released that in our sustainability report against total lendings and advances of, again, 6 asset classes, 585 billion ringgit. 585 billion ringgit. That's our loans and advances on 6 asset classes, which is equivalent to the GDP of Kenya and Zambia combined. Okay, we have finance emissions of 25.8 million metric tons of carbon. So we know where we are, right? And we felt that we were compelled to disclose it. CDP, please take note. So we announced that as well, and that gave us the motivation. We need to do something about it, right? So what we have done now, or what we are doing now, 2 things. Number 1 is we are nearing completion. I wanted to say that we are complete, but one of my colleagues says nearly a little bit more. We come up with an emission tracker and dashboard. We are able to see sector by sector, account by account, client by client, new deal by new deal, what would be the corresponding emission against the loan. Okay? A lot of work is being put into that now. Hopefully we can have that soon. But also what we are just embarking on is to do a sectoral pathway for all our sectors on SBTi. Yep. So that's where we are.
Thank you. Okay, there's so much here that I'm going to just go with one question for each panelist now, and then we'll see about Q&A. Okay. Actually, Shahril, I'll go back to you on the financial emissions. Can you share with us how Maybank established this Scope 3 financial emissions baseline?
Well, as I said, it's a complex process, but it's a process that is there. And this is based on the PCAF methodology. Yeah, I'm not going to say that we created this, no. So you've got to sign up with PCAF first, yeah? And you may want to work with an external help because it's very labor intensive, right? And bearing in mind, we have operations in 18 countries. Right, so and a lot of data you need to go back and input. So my team and the guy leading it is here. We worked on it, days and nights, and a lot of deduplication needed. A lot of errors need to be corrected. Sometimes lost in translation, lost in transition. They give us, oh, you wanted US dollar, but we give you in Filipino peso. Okay, let's do it again. All right. So those were the things that we did. But essentially, it's based on PCAF methodology, which when we started this was based on 6 asset classes. Now they've added 2 more asset classes. There'll be 8. We are going to have to go through that process once again, because we have a big insurance shop within Maybank called Etika, and Etika is the biggest composite insurer in Malaysia. So we're going to see huge numbers there soon, I guess. Thank
you. Can we go to Rashid? And when you spoke, you were telling us about ensuring that with each of your initiatives that was being transferred to those in your value chain as well. So biomass, for example, you wanted to see that suppliers, etc., were carrying that out. Can you tell us more about the challenges of collaborating with those stakeholders?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, the challenge that we have is essentially, the breadth and width of our supply chain itself. So if you look at our feedstock itself, we source from more than 1,100 different mills globally, across all countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America. And then in total, we also source from more than 60,000 smallholders as well globally across all of our operations. So the key challenge that we have is essentially trying to obtain traceability of our supply chain. So traceability of the supply chain is essentially knowing exactly where the oil that we purchase from originates all the way up to the farm. So just to give you a rough idea, in total from Sime Darby plantation side, we produce roughly around 2.4 million tons of CPO annually. And we actually purchase third-party oils to the tune of around 1.5 million tons annually. So that's 1.5 million tons of crude palm oil that you need to trace all the way up to the mills. And after you've traced it to the mills, you trace it all the way up to the estates. So there's multiple layers of suppliers that you need to engage. And one of the key things that we do is basically, we have a large supplier engagement program where, we actually get all of our suppliers to commit to our responsible sourcing guidelines. So at least they are aware of these other sort of expectations that are required. And then we work with a lot of third parties to monitor our supply chain. So one of the key things that we monitor is basically, one large source of emissions is land use change and the issue of deforestation in the supply chain. So we work with multiple partners where we utilize satellite monitoring to monitor basically tree cover loss within the supply sheds that we source from. And once we sort of identify any sort of tree cover loss, we have teams on the ground which basically engage with suppliers to ensure that rectification is done in the case that these sort of cases are are sort of confirmed, right? And we also work with certain partners as well, where we actually work on smallholder programs. So, for example, a program that we have in the northern region in Perak, where we work with an NGO partner, where we are engaging with smallholders there on climate smart agriculture, for example. And part of that sort of engagement is basically trying to get them to also reduce emissions on their operations as well. So there are multiple approaches that we use to sort of engage with them, but the key thing here and the key challenge that we have is basically traceability of our supply chain. And to date we are around 97% traceable all the way to the mill, but to the plantation itself we are probably close to around 70% traceable. So there's still a way to go to basically have full visibility of our supply chain.
Thank you. Can we move then to Petronas and One Sayuti? And this issue, not just that of partnership, but technologies in terms of adopting technologies to reduce those Scope 3 emissions.
Thank you. Maybe I just continue from Anwar mentioned. I think one of the key challenge is really about changing mindset and behavior, right? When we talk about Scope 3, because when we talk about Scope 3, for Petronas, we have 4,700 vendors and suppliers in our ecosystem. And I must say, last year, a lot of efforts on engaging, really about creating awareness and elevating the conversation on the needs to adhere to the GHG protocol of monitoring, reporting, validating your emissions number. But Malaysia as a whole is still very much in the voluntary carbon market, right? There's no price on carbon. So oftentimes we are stuck in the conversation of why, right? Instead of moving towards the how. So I think the energy transition literacy is across, I think is still, I would say, is low. And a lot of efforts is really about engaging and conducting the master classes, making sure the fundamentals, we get it right, so that we can move the ecosystem together. Because Petronas Net Zero by 2050 is also at the back. There's 4,700 vendors and suppliers, right? And if they don't move or get on board, and it will be very difficult to pull the whole value chain ecosystem. I think another challenge is about the harmonizations of policy in the country, right? Because Malaysia, as we all know, our fuels are still subsidized. So there's elements of carrot and stick. How do we price carbon in the right way to get the right behavior and change of lifestyles? At the same time, how do you incentivize the new technology and new solutions? So for Petronas, when we talk about getting to net zero, there are two prongs to it. One is actually decarbonization of existing assets and the future projects. So we, in our pathway, we put or outline the 4 decarb levers, we call it. One is zero routine flaring and venting, making sure our assets are going towards zero routine flaring and venting by 2030. In fact, we signed up to the World Bank Zero Routine Flaring Initiative in 2021. And the second is energy efficiency. We know there's a conversation on Energy Efficiency Act at the ministry level. So I think that will then, push or nudge towards, consumer, in terms of consumption of energy, become more responsible, right? The third one is electrifications. How do we making sure some of the assets moving from, oil-based to renewable source of energy supply utilities. And the last decarb lever is CCS. This is a big technology, carbon capture and storage. I'm sure you've heard. I think Petronas is working collaboratively with some of the states here in Malaysia, really to bring the CCS technology to Malaysia. In fact, the Kasawari project in Sarawak will be, once commissioned in 2026, will be the largest CCS in the world at 3.3 to 3.5 million ton of capture carbon in one single location. And Malaysia and Indonesia, we have a large potential because of the old reservoir, empty reservoir in the past oil and gas operation for this opportunity. And we can also offer as a carbon capture storage for the other neighboring countries and region in this part of the world as well. That's on the decarb, right? The 4 levers. And at the same time, we're also accelerating efforts towards clean energy solutions. And last year, we formed this new entity called Gentari, Generasi Lestari. Gentari in its vertical has 3 businesses. One is solar and renewables. We also have hydrogen and also green mobility. So all these 3 verticals in Gentari to accelerate the clean energy business and to get to customers in the fastest way possible. And in fact, we have very ambitious target for solar and renewable 30 to 40 gigawatts by 2030. Clean hydrogen, this is blue and green hydrogen, 1.2 million ton of hydrogen by 2030. And for green mobility, 10% of market in Asia Pacific. So that's on Gentari. We also form a division called Carbon Management Division in our upstream, really to look at CCS as an opportunity for Malaysia to be the hub for the region. And our downstream business, we are very active on biofuels and bioenergy. In fact, in the news, the Sustainable Aviation Fuel is our collaboration with Malaysia Airline Group and also Neste to bring the SAF and to pilot SAF in Malaysia. We also look at bioenergy carbon capture and storage, BACS. There's another technology that we are also exploring, and also DAC, the direct air capture technology. It's kind of still nascent, but I think it has a lot of potential in addressing scope 3 emissions as well. Thank you.
Yes, just looking for, sometimes taking advantage of the nascent technologies, as Dr. Dennis said earlier, you know that these will come on stream. Shane, could I invite you to give us a bit more detail? You reminded us that IJM really moves across upstream, midstream, downstream, right, of the value chain. Can you give us a bit more detail on challenges with working with scope 3 emissions at whichever point of that chain? Give us a bit more detail on the challenges and how you have overcome a specific challenge.
Yeah, I think from the poll earlier this afternoon and just the one that I just concluded as well, we can see that many organizations have a problem with getting data from the supply chain. I think fortunately for us, it was very tedious, but that wasn't the main challenge. We stuck it through and we still managed to get it. What we did was, for us as a main contractor, we were able to sort of control the processes on site, and we were able to come up with a system where we would be getting, or we were able to actually determine about 8 to 10 main materials that contributes, you could say, maybe 80% in value of a particular project. And we would then track those 8 to 10 materials across the life of that project on a monthly basis. So data wasn't the biggest challenge. I think for us, what we are now facing is that biggest challenge is actually getting our supply chain to commit to a reduction or to reduce. And this, I think, has to be seen from a standpoint of understanding their psyche, right, where they're coming from. The nature of construction contracts is one that's very transient, meaning to say that a project only lasts typically about 3 years, 2 to 3 years. And a subcontractor or a vendor who works with us on one project may not necessarily work with us on the next one, and so on. So it's not going to be compelling enough if IJM alone were to ask a contractor or a subcontractor or a supplier to commit to zero. I think what we need to see, for us, what we realized was that in order for us to compel the supply chain downwards, we had to go sideways, right? So, for example, what we realized, or at least what I realized, was the UNGC had about 5, large developers that were based in the Klang Valley as members. And so if all 5 of us, for example, were to collaborate and have a common system such as the one that was developed by the UNGC, it would then make life a lot easier and more compelling. It would be more worthwhile for our supply chains to then comply with perhaps fewer different methodologies by large companies, which would then give us a better chance of us asking them to reduce their carbon emissions. So what we realized was that collaboration was going to be very key for us, whether it's through like-minded peers or through industry associations as well. And I think if you think about how a construction site, so we are a hard-to-abate sector. If we take the view of embodied carbon, as I mentioned to you earlier, 90%, more than 90% of our Category 1 Scope 3 emissions come from just 3 main materials, right? Cement, steel, and concrete. Until we see, and these are very hard to replace. And so it's the belief of our subcontractors as well on whether what efforts they put in will result in some form of meaningful reduction. If embodied carbon is so difficult to reduce at this stage at least, then their belief of making that difference or making that commitment will be a lot less powerful as well. If you look at operational carbon, profiles, then for us to reduce our operational carbon emissions at site based on stationary or mobile combustion emissions, the investment cost for us for the sector or for sector players is quite significant compared to the pricing of the open tenders, for example. So we are in a single margin kind of sector, profit margins kind of sector. It's not going to be easy to compel our supply chain to make big investments for 1 or 2 projects and not have that certainty of it being something that they can reuse again project to project. So if we understand that, then you can see it's tough for the supply chain to also move without government incentives or without regulatory push or without our customers collectively wanting to pay more for some of these products. That's going to be one of the big challenges we think that we're facing.
Thank you, Shane. Let's go to some Q&A because as we're talking of stakeholders and relationships and actually also gathering data on Scope 3, there are some interesting questions talking of working with your vendors or stakeholders and also capturing data on them. So I'm actually going to go to that second question. How did your company start collecting data, Scope 3 data? Was it done internally or did you manage to capture the data from your supply chain? How were you ensuring that there was you had enough information along the value chain? I think I might go back to Shane and then see, and then...
Yeah, for us, in most cases, the construction parts of our business does the work internally as well for the property development, for our highway concessions, for the port expansions, things like that. So we are in control of materials that come to site. And so as I mentioned earlier, we were in the position to actually determine the main materials that were contributing to about 80% or more in value of any particular project. And then we are able to track it on a monthly basis thereafter because we have the project site under our control.
And we've also talked about traceability and trackability. And the top question then is, how equipped are your vendors in fulfilling your Scope 3 decarbonization targets? Okay, are you merely documenting submission or through full audit records and results? I think I'll hand over to Rashid. this point, or any of our panelists who'd want to answer that question.
So I guess, with regards to our particular suppliers, right? To be honest, not really. So quite a lot of work that we do is around engagement and awareness raising, capacity building. And we specifically focus, like what I mentioned just now, specifically focus on our feedstock suppliers, because that is basically where majority of the emissions come from. And when it comes to when it comes to our feedstock sort of emissions and feedstock suppliers, we already know what are the key sort of emission sources: land use change, methane emissions. Those are probably going to cover probably 80% of their emissions, roughly, right? So that's where we actually embedded that into what we call our responsible sourcing guidelines, and included that as part of the engagements with all of our suppliers for feedstock. And that's where we also do the sort of monitoring with regards to, especially around land use change and deforestation, using the satellites and all. So it's not about them having commitments to reduce their emissions or implement anything, but more for them to basically understand what the expectations are first, and then making sure that they implement the right practices in place. We also use things like certification processes, for example, to basically manage our suppliers as well. So, for example, with smallholders in Papua New Guinea, for example, we managed to get 100% of them certified to the RSPO, Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, where there are certain practices and policies and that they need to implement, which basically would reduce the amount of emissions, and is part of the certification process as well. And in Papua New Guinea, I think we work with around 15,000 smallholders and managed to get them certified. So it's basically a multiple prong approach where we just need to figure out what's the best way for them to understand what the requirements are, and then monitor the effectiveness of the implementation.
Shahril, I think there's a question for you on one of these. How are banks, that's our top question at the moment, how are banks intending to decarbonize their retail portfolio, such as housing loans? How do they intend to keep it green?
That's a good question, but I'll put some context to that, because we are in a race against time, right? So everybody's talking about prioritizing. I mentioned earlier that we got our finance emission calculation. Now, having the calculation is just one thing, but what do you do with it? I think that's more important, right? So we've calculated that 25.8 million metric tons of finance emission, 97% of that comes from only 3 countries: Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. Okay, 80% of all of that finance emissions come from only 3 asset classes. Okay, when we've cut it down further, about 70% of that comes only from 156 accounts, leading to only 80 clients. Can you believe? The combined GDP of Kenya and Zambia, that's the size of our loans that we've calculated, 25.8 million metric tons. We pinpoint to 70, 80 clients, which makes our job a lot easier. Because once we come up with the decarbonization and transition pathway, we know how we talk to people. It's a big corporate issue. It's not a retail issue. Our retail emissions are very low. But as I said, we prioritize without leaving it alone. We've come up with various programs. A big part of what we do for retail is EV financing. So that's well underway as well, and we're trying to promote that. We've come up with various incentives. We also have come up with solar financing packaging with our homes as well. So that's also well underway. But it is a big corporate issue and not a retail issue, actually.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question, because there's a question, I think, that's specifically for Petronas. Now, it's not up there, but it's on my phone. How does Petronas, being an ONG, plan to manage the downstream section, emissions from usage of Petronas products?
I think if you look at the 15 categories of the Scope 3, right, for Petronas and for any oil and gas company, in fact, Category 11 is the most material, right? Use of sold products. And in fact, from the benchmarking exercise that we did with our third party, 80 to over 90% from category 11 of the scope 3. And this is the fuel that all of us, use in our vehicles, from our power plants, our LNG customers in Japan, and so on. So I think it takes a lot of conversation and engagement. What we did was really understanding the data and enormity of that data and the size of a scope 3, right? Of course, there are technology that we've discussed when it comes to biofuels, SAF, but that's one small portion to it. I think what we need is also to start discussing about the balancing of energy security and also environmental sustainability. I think that's a whole different topic that we need to debate, right? Because pressing one button on one lever without addressing the other will also cause trouble in the long term. So if you look at the IEA scenarios, even in the most stringent environmental scenarios, there will be oil and gas portion in the 2050 scenario, but it must be carbon abated. It must be, lowest emission possible. And I don't think we have the clarity post 2030. I think we have the clarity on technology from now on to 2030, CCS, BACs, and the DAC hydrogen. Or beyond that is something that we need to work together. I think the company and also the value chain supply together in finding the solution. I think that's why in addressing energy transition, it must be an inclusive kind of approach. It cannot be, you start to alienate certain sector or certain segments because of the product of the supply. At the end of the day, it goes back to the energy trilemma of the security, affordability, and also environmental sustainability, especially for developing economies like Malaysia, that we need to balance. Thank you.
That has given us a lot to think about, and I'm very grateful to our whole panel for addressing all those issues, from data, from trackability and traceability, to relationships, to managing all the way upstream to downstream. So can I thank again Shane, Shahril, Rashid, one total. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Shane, Mr. Rashid, Mr. Shahril, Mr. Wan Sayuti for your valuable contributions to this insightful panel discussion, and Professor Adeline for moderating the session.